shall we move to Genevieve Liveley? She's our next speaker, and she's a professor of classics, a RIS fellow and Turing fellow at the University of Bristol. She's a narratologist whose research interests focus upon narratives and narrative theories, both ancient and modern, and their impact on future thinking. She has particularly research interest in the stories that program cultural and socio-technical narratives about human interactions with new technologies. She has published a number of books and articles on these topics and has also worked on the classical tradition, house theory, and cyborgs. She is currently seconded to GCHQ, working on a project examining anticipating and cyber risk with a socio-technical research team at the National Center for Cybersecurity. She's a co-founder of Flint, Futures Literacy Through Narrative, and today she's going to talk about the AI Futures Literacy.
Thanks, Zemina, and Allison. Thank you so much. That was fantastic, and beautifully sets up. Not that was what it was doing, but segues beautifully into one of the things that I want to kind of focus on in my section here, which is futures literacy. So when the government, the UK government, carried out its post-mortem of that sort of education algorithm debacle in the summer, one of the things that the report highlighted was the need for something that the government calls anticipatory governance. The idea of just thinking through what the multi-order consequences of your actions in the present might involve. And so I was involved in some conversations towards the end of that report about how governments, how various government departments really upskill themselves in this notion of anticipatory governance, anticipation, futures thinking. They think through about the human impact, exactly, Allison, what you were discussing, the human impact of the decisions that are made and then kind of hard baked into kind of policy and algorithmic decision making. So that leads us very nicely into what I want to talk about now, which is AI futures literacy. This is part of the work I've been doing, as Zemina pointed out in the introduction, with the UK's National Centre for Cybersecurity. I'm a risks fellow, and that forms part of my work with them. And it's also part of some work I've been doing as my Turing Fellowship, thinking about the way that thinking about the futures, it gets very meta after a while, but thinking about how our futures thinking really shapes the art of the possible in this space, and just really reinforcing Allison's point, bringing it back to thinking about our human limitations and our possibilities, and just trying to keep that sort of that human focus in the conversation. With that in mind, I'm going to start with, if my transition will work. Whenever we practice the transitions, it works, and now it's not going to happen, is it? Right. I may have jumped too fast now. I want to start with sort of positioning this work in the context of UNESCO, who have been championing something that they label futures literacy for about a decade now. It already seems slightly old-fashioned, even to a classicist like myself. The big kind of tagline is on your slide here. And I think it's really salient for all of us working in emerging technologies and socio-technical impact sort of interface there. So this is one of the things that I want printed on t-shirts and mugs at all the kind of in-person workshops that I attend. And it reminds us that we should try to abandon the effort to try to be so clever that we can choose the right model, find the right data, or make the best guess. Again, this speaks to so much of Allison was talking about algorithmic decision making. There's no way to outsmart the complexity of reality. Unforeseeable novelty is a certainty. Instead, according to the UNESCO approach, we should try to develop the capacity to use the future, use it in a range of different ways, not be limited by so-called prediction or by narrowed conceptions of desired and desirable futures. This is all about being futures literate. In a nutshell, that's futures literacy. Why does this matter? And why does this matter for us involved in this conversation today? When we're thinking about AI, when we're thinking about the future, the two inherently, I think, go together. When we're thinking and talking about AI in socio-technical context, we're anticipating future risks. We're imagining potential disruptions and disruptors. We're considering possible harms, but also possible benefits, multi-order consequences in both cases. We're trying to assess the probability and also hopefully scoping strategies to deal with them, both for good and for ill. And I'm trying to propose some new ways in which we might better understand the dynamics of this, the anticipatory thinking that goes into this kind of futures thinking. And my ambition is that we can, by building up our skills in futures literacy, we can actually grow a stronger socio-technical capability in this thing I'm calling AI futures literacy specifically. I want to kick off this evening and outlining some of the sort of benefits of this new approach by using the tools of my trade, which is narratives, so stories, mythic archetypes, storytelling, to help kind of surface some of the cognitive biases that affect the futures thinking of both human and artificial intelligences. I'm going to kind of frame this for you again with another piece of UNESCO's champion for futures literacy, Riel Miller, who says that to be really sort of articulate in the domain of futures literacy, we need to get better as individuals, as societies, as scientists, as policymakers. As individuals, we need to be better at rigorous imagining. You can see why I'm attracted to this as someone who works on stories. And we need to develop and hone that capability. And that way we can begin to develop and question the theories and the models that we're using to think through variables and relationships, the metrics, the definitions, everything that we use to make sense of the present. And Miller adds this note here. The nota bene is not me. This is in the UNESCO position. Pattern recognition and data mining here is wholly insufficient. We need to do more. We need to be much more rigorous and robust in our interrogation of the data that we use to think about the future. This means then that the point of futures literacy is to become better at imagining different futures and to use those futures. This isn't, playing with crystal balls. I did say earlier that I can lower the tone in any conversation in a very short space of time, but this isn't all crystal balls. This is about using the future, using it to discern system boundaries, to identify relationships, spot patterns of emergence, to invent and to detect changes in the conditions of change, really to rethink all the assumptions that we use to understand the present and to take action on it. This isn't just a kind of frolic in the park. This is really about trying to use actions in the present to shape a desirable future. And as I say, in that respect, it's a practical capability, and literacy, I think, well describes the work that we want to do in this space. I always think it's worthwhile just taking a moment to emphasize that this really is not about prediction or prophecy or divining the future in any respect. Futures literacy is really about using, identifying and then using the right tools, finding the best methods for your particular space to try and understand and to manage that futures thinking. And make better decisions in the present, and let's say thinking through the multi-order human societal consequences of the disruptive technology, the AI intervention that you're engaged with. Now, it's not just me and the team at UNESCO who have been championing notions of futures literacy in this space. So there have been concerns about traditional ways of thinking through futures thinking in emerging technology for at least the last decade. And the tools, the futures thinking capability and tools in use by governments nationally and internationally. And this is particularly in the domain of thinking about emerging technology. First flagged up by UNESCO team back in 2012. And since then, they've been trying to develop a global futures literacy capability. And they're trying to address a skills gap, really, a competence gap that they identify as being a kind of global weakness. And some of the work that I've been doing in the last couple of years is trying to think through those areas of weaknesses, what they really look like, particularly how they pertain to our thinking about AI and cybersecurity is my particular kind of purview here. So there are, I think, there are many more, but for today, we'll just sweep through these kind of 6 issues, these limitations to futures thinking. First one's a lack of breadth. I think that's something that we might all recognize in the sort of scholarship and the fields that we work in. Traditional futures thinking is heavily dependent on a very limited palette of tools and techniques, very much weighted towards quantum and statistical data. So what we're trying to do is kind of mix this up. The more people you talk to, the more information you can bring to it, quantitative as well as qualitative, the better your outcomes are likely to be in this space. Second problem here is lack of diversity. Again, this picks up one of the points that Allison brilliantly made in her presentation. Futures for the many in society are too often being imagined by the few. And then this sort of unintentionally bakes in past inequalities into the futures and reproducing kind of historic inequalities. And also cementing in the biases and values of those who are in power now. And we can't change the future in this way. I think that this lack of diversity is a real issue in this space. We just end up contributing to the ongoing marginalization of those who aren't part of the conversation, who aren't making decisions. Again, this was very much to the heart of Allison's paper. My third area of weakness in traditional modes of futures thinking in this area is lack of complexity. There's a tendency to overemphasize stability, certainty, unity, and clarity. There's an implication that trends are inevitable, and there's a tendency in so much algorithmic work and AI work to kind of simplify, to kind of sort of quiet out the noise that we might actually want to be paying attention to sometimes. We certainly see the restriction in the range of possible futures, and a focus instead upon probable futures or even preferable futures, and preferable to whom is always a question I want to ask. Data-driven futures approaches also tend to obscure the important contextualizing messiness. I think it's the messiness where some of the most interesting insights into kind of future development is to be found, and I want to spend more time on that. Some traditional approaches to futures thinking are surprising in the way that they sort of manifest a closed system, a future, a sort of quasi-mechanical, almost sort of Newtonian worldview. The future is linear, it's closed, it's singular, and therefore predictable. And of course, we know that that is not ever the case. And I want to kind of bring in more of the mess, the chaos that we inhabit and experience when we're thinking about futures in these socio-technical systems, the kind of chaotic complexity of this system's thinking. Number 4 as an area of weakness is lack of novelty. So much futures thinking is based on past and present experience, historic data. And this tends to exhibit what I call presentism or chronocentrism, after Garrison Wilson's great work in this space. And this really limits our ability to expect the unexpected. This kind of what tends to highlight known trends and again to privilege the concerns and the interests of the present moment. So the future lacks rigorous alterity. We're not expecting difference until it comes and bites us. Lack of agency is a huge issue in this space too. Futures thinking has a tendency to be sort of techno-utopian in its orientation, with the risk then that we have futures that are dehumanized, decontextualized, and tending to present the kind of human futures where those are taken on board as sort of mechanistic. We get sort of behaviorist models of the human being and of human society, quite thin, sort of almost cybernetic view of both human and machine intelligence that downplays the importance of the individual, of our agency, and our investment in our own individual and collective futures. And so that, I think that really comes into the rubric of lack of agency. The big one for me, which I think is where futures literacy comes in and helps address all 6 of these, is a straightforward lack of competence. So much futures thinking is under-acknowledged as a pretty primitive sense-making process here. It's limited to the human cognitive faculty that is what enables us to plan, of course. It's linked to speech, to walking, but it's also linked very much to the cognitive powers of the imagination. It pre-exists, this power of anticipation, pre-exists our ability to walk and talk. It's pretty basic. And therefore, it's particularly susceptible to kind of heuristics and bias and kind of, you know, cultural weakness in this sense. And some of the cognitive biases that particularly influence our futures thinking, I've outlined in this table for you. And again, I think you'll recognize some of these from your own work, your own discourse, and those of the kind of colleagues that you work with. Now, these biases affect all of us when it comes to anticipation and futures thinking, I said, because it is such a kind of primitive aspect of our work and the way that we think. I'm just trying to do a time check while rustling my papers. And being futures literate doesn't do away with these biases, but it really helps to surface them. I think part of the problem that we need to do is first address that we have these problems, and then we can move on. In any cognitive anticipation process, we're not dealing with concrete certainties, we're dealing with present imaginaries, the future possible worlds. And that's a possibility space, therefore. And I think this is where that possibility space is particularly akin to fictional story worlds, which is why I think narrative tools can come in and help. And one aspect of this narrative bias in futures thinking that's particularly relevant to our conversations today about socio-technical context and inequalities around AI is something identified as the rebellious robot motif. And this doesn't just apply to robots, but any notions of artificial minds. And the work they've been doing, looking at AI narratives from the last 3,000 years, shows up an unexpected facet that there are repeated patterns, repeated tropes, as well as plenty of unexpected, chaotic and messy parts of the story that reveal that the human brain mind isn't very good with artificial artifacts. And this is because cognitive narratologists suggest we've evolved to deal with natural kinds and natural artifacts, but not with artifacts that look and act like natural kinds. And this seems to have developed a distrust in the way that we negotiate artificial intelligence, artificial minds, and artificial creatures. The development of certain plot lines, therefore, shape the human-computer interaction here. The rebellious robot plotline, which is seen to be an expression of our attempt to resolve the state of cognitive ambiguity that these artificial kinds that look like natural kinds represents to us. This notion then of the rebellious robot plot has important implications, I think, for thinking about the socio-technical features of AI, because it highlights the narrative biases, the baggage and heuristics that we carry with us when we engage in futures thinking in this domain. Will the cognitive adaptations that prime us as humans in the 21st century to anticipate the rebellious robot motif in story worlds also prime us to mistrust AI systems and tools in the real world too? And to what extent can such mistrust in AI be mitigated by human AI teaming and other interventions? And can insights like these that we've been discussing today from futures literacy help us to better understand and negotiate trust in the relationship between different stakeholders in this space, past, present, and future? So far, I have more questions than I have answers, but this seems like a reasonably good point to pause the chapter in the story so far. Thank you.